A flight attendant tried to shove a black teen out the emergency exit mid-flight, but seconds later, his father turned the tables and dragged the attacker out instead. What happened next will leave you speechless. He reached for the exit handle with a baby in his grip, sure no one would dare stop him. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The moment Marcus Delroy stepped onto Skyward Air Flight 732, something felt wrong. He couldn't name it at first. Maybe it was the sudden drop in cabin noise when he entered, or the way the air seemed just a bit too still, too heavy. But the feeling grew stronger as he made his way down the narrow aisle, his 6-month-old son, Ezra, bundled tightly against his chest in a soft blue carrier. The child stirred but didn't cry, his tiny fingers curling around Marcus's shirt collar. A few passengers glanced up and quickly looked away. Some shifted uncomfortably, the universal language of travelers bracing for the possibility of a crying baby. Marcus had seen it before. Tired glares, forced smiles, the silent prayers of those hoping for a quiet flight. He ignored them all. This wasn't about their comfort. It was about Ezra, about showing himself that he could balance fatherhood with the demanding work of his career. It was about not giving in to fear. But then he saw the flight attendant. Tall, rigid, and expressionless, the man stood midway down the aisle, near the galley door, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. His uniform was immaculate, creased in all the right places, every button gleaming. His name tag read, Orrin Vance. The second their eyes met, Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. Orrin didn't look away. He didn't smile. His jaw was clenched, his posture too still, like a soldier waiting for a command. There was no warmth in his gaze, only scrutiny. As Marcus passed him, he could feel Orrin's eyes track his every step like a scanner picking apart a threat. Ezra let out a soft grunt, and Orrin's brow twitched, barely noticeable, but enough to betray irritation. Marcus found his row, slid into his seat, and gently unhooked Ezra from the carrier. He placed the child in the seat cradle beside him and began to hum, a low, rhythmic tune, more for himself than for Ezra. The baby cooed softly and settled in. Marcus adjusted the blanket, making sure Ezra's arms were free but warm, then sat back with a quiet exhale. He was trying not to overthink it. But Orrin hadn't moved. From across the aisle, the flight attendant remained posted like a statue, eyes flicking from passenger to passenger, always returning to Marcus. Not overtly, not enough for anyone else to notice. But it was happening, and Marcus felt it like pressure building behind a sealed valve. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, his voice polite but firm. Orrin didn't answer immediately. He took a small step forward, his shoes clicking softly against the floor. "Just doing my job, sir," he said at last, voice smooth but too even, too controlled. Then he turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Marcus's eyes lingered on him as he disappeared into the galley. There was something about the way Orrin moved, precise, calculated, like every gesture was rehearsed. Marcus had worked with men like that in the systems world, people who controlled outcomes with obsession, whose calm always felt like a warning. Ezra shifted in the cradle, letting out a soft whimper. Marcus leaned forward, adjusting the strap slightly, whispering reassurance. "You're okay, buddy. We're okay," he said under his breath. But his own heart beat faster now. The hum of the engines had started, and the lights above flickered to signal departure. A soft chime rang through the cabin as the pilot's voice crackled overhead, welcoming them and announcing a smooth flight path. Marcus didn't hear most of it. His mind was on Orrin Vance. He remembered reading an article years ago about people who could predict danger, not with facts, but with feeling, gut instinct, pattern recognition. Marcus believed in that. His work depended on detecting when something was just slightly out of sync, slightly off rhythm, and right now everything about Orrin felt off rhythm. The plane began to taxi. Marcus looked out the window, watching the rows of lights blur by. He tried to shake it off. He was tired, overthinking, projecting nerves about traveling with an infant for the first time. But deep down, he didn't believe that. Orrin returned during takeoff, walking down the aisle to check seatbelts. He paused at Marcus's row for a second too long. His eyes glanced at Ezra, then at Marcus, then at the overhead bin. Again, no smile, just that unreadable, silent judgment. Marcus's hand instinctively moved toward the cradle's edge, resting protectively over Ezra's chest. The plane lifted off the runway, the cabin dipping gently with the climb. Some passengers murmured or chuckled softly at the sensation, but Marcus stayed quiet, tense. His son's eyes opened briefly, then shut again. Orrin didn't say a word. He simply continued down the aisle, but not before casting one final glance over his shoulder. Marcus felt it like a cold whisper against the back of his neck. The plane steadied into its ascent. The lights dimmed slightly, and the flight attendants began to move into their routines. But Marcus could no longer focus on the journey ahead. His thoughts had already split in two, one half watching Ezra's every breath, the other keeping tabs on the tall man in the Navy uniform who seemed to be watching him from the shadows. And though nothing had happened yet, the message in Marcus's mind was crystal clear. The storm began in silence. Marcus first noticed something was off when he pressed the call button. It lit up with a soft chime, the symbol glowing above his seat. He waited, watching the aisle. A flight attendant passed, Orrin Vance, but didn't even glance in his direction. The man walked right by, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed on the far wall of the cabin as if Marcus didn't exist. A few rows ahead, another passenger waved for assistance. Orrin turned back almost instantly, a polite nod, a practiced smile. But when he passed Marcus again, the expression vanished like it had never been there. Ezra whimpered a soft, restless cry. Marcus gently rocked the cradle and leaned over, humming under his breath to soothe his son. He tried to ignore the tightness in his chest, chalking it up to nerves and fatigue. Maybe he was reading too much into things. Maybe Orrin had simply missed the signal. Still, the tension didn't fade. A few minutes later, Marcus tried again. He stood halfway, making eye contact with Orrin as he approached. "Excuse me, could I get some water, please?" Orrin didn't stop. His eyes met Marcus's briefly, sharp and flat. "We'll be through shortly," he muttered, barely audible. "But you're already serving," Marcus pointed out calmly, gesturing to the rows ahead where men were sipping from plastic cups. Orrin didn't respond. He just kept walking. Marcus sat down slowly. He felt the shift in energy now. Real, undeniable, something cold in Orrin's gaze. Not rushed, not distracted, targeted, calculated. Ezra stirred again, letting out a louder wail. Marcus immediately leaned forward, cradling the baby gently and bouncing him slightly. The cries didn't last long, but they drew looks from several passengers. Curious, some sympathetic. One man, seated across the aisle in a faded blue hoodie, raised his brows at Marcus with an expression that read, "Is he always like that?" Marcus gave a quick shake of his head, unsure whether the man meant the baby or the attendant. But the moment hung between them like a question left unanswered. Footsteps returned. Orrin swept down the aisle again, this time slower, more deliberate. He paused at Marcus's row, glancing down at Ezra, then back up at Marcus. "You may want to quiet him," he said, voice low but firm. "It's a shared space." Marcus blinked, surprised. "He's 6 months old," he replied, keeping his tone even. "He's doing fine." Orrin's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Fine is relative," he said, then moved on. Something shifted inside Marcus. Not anger yet, but a heat rising through his chest, a tension building in the space behind his ribs. He turned back to Ezra, who had begun to settle again, cheeks flushed, eyes blinking slowly. "You're okay," Marcus whispered. "We're okay." But he didn't believe it. He watched Orrin from then on, watched the way he poured water for others with casual efficiency, how he laughed softly at a joke from a passenger in first class, how his shoulders only seemed to tense when he approached the rows near Marcus. It was like clockwork. Each pass, each glance carried an edge sharper than professionalism. Marcus couldn't stop analyzing it. He was a systems engineer by trade, trained to notice anomalies, patterns, flaws. And something in Orrin's behavior screamed pattern. At one point, Orrin paused a few rows back, speaking quietly to another male crew member. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but he caught the flick of Orrin's eyes in his direction. The other attendant, a shorter man with sandy hair, didn't say much. His shoulders tightened. He nodded and walked off. Ezra shifted again. Marcus gently hummed, his voice blending with the ambient hum of the engines, which had become like a distant wall of sound, steady, unmoving. It was almost hypnotic, but the comfort it might have brought was lost in the rising current of Marcus's unease. As he leaned over Ezra, he felt a shadow pause beside him. Orrin. "No outside food is allowed on board," the flight attendant said flatly, gesturing toward the bottle Marcus had resting in the seat pocket. Marcus looked up, puzzled. "It's formula. For my son." "There are rules," Oren said without blinking. "Next time, inform the staff. We provide options." Marcus stared at him. "It's pre-cleared," he replied, voice even. "They scanned it at the gate. You can double-check the log." Oren didn't answer. He just stared a moment longer, then turned on his heel and disappeared toward the galley. A man in the row behind leaned forward slightly. "Is that guy always like this?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough not to be heard by the staff. "Not sure," Marcus replied, not looking back. "But he's watching me." And it was true. The more Marcus observed, the more he noticed. Oren's walk would slow just slightly near his row. His posture would stiffen. He passed other babies in the cabin without even flinching. But every time Ezra let out a sound, even a happy babble, Oren's expression tightened. Marcus checked the time. Still nearly 2 hours to go. He pressed his back into the seat, trying to breathe through the rising discomfort. Conflict was not what he wanted. He just wanted to get home, to finish the day as a father proud of surviving his first solo flight with his baby boy. But there was a weight now, a heaviness that had nothing to do with altitude. And as Oren passed once more, his gaze lingering a second too long on the child's face, Marcus felt the first unmistakable chill of danger. He didn't know what Oren intended. He only knew that the man was watching too closely, and not out of concern. Disdain. No, not just that, something colder. He adjusted Ezra's blanket and leaned over his son again, humming softly into the cradle of his neck. But his eyes remained fixed on the aisle, watching, waiting. Because somewhere deep in his gut, Marcus knew, the higher they flew, the more dangerous the silence became. Without warning, Oren Vance reached down and unbuckled the safety belt securing baby Ezra to his cradle. The motion was so swift, so deliberate, that for a split second, Marcus Delroy's brain refused to register what he was seeing. One moment he was rocking Ezra gently through a patch of turbulence, whispering soothing sounds to calm the infant's startled cries, and the next, Oren's hands were on his son. "What are you doing?" Marcus snapped, his voice loud enough to draw a few heads from nearby rows. Oren didn't look at him. His jaw was clenched, his eyes focused on the child, and under his breath he muttered with chilling precision, "Time to get rid of distractions." The words landed like ice down Marcus's spine. Every nerve in his body sparked alive as he lunged forward, throwing out an arm between the cradle and the attendant. The turbulence had barely subsided, but the real shaking now came from within him. He stared into Oren's face, searching for logic, some miscommunication, some protocol he didn't understand. But what he saw was something else. Not confusion, not concern, cruelty. The passengers around them had fallen silent, their small talk and laughter replaced by stillness and murmured confusion. A few leaned out into the aisle, necks craning. One man in a flannel shirt blinked slowly, as if waiting for the punchline of a joke he didn't understand. But there was no joke, no policy, no protocol. Oren lifted Ezra from the cradle. "No!" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with panic as he reached for his son. But Oren turned, his grip firm, and took a step toward the emergency exit. Time fractured. Marcus's legs moved before his mind could catch up. He vaulted from his seat, heart pounding against his ribs, every part of his body surging toward his son. "Put him down," he roared, shoving past the narrow seats, his shoulder clipping the tray table as it snapped upward. Passengers gasped audibly now, several rising to their feet. Confusion spread like wildfire. One older man near the back tried to stand but was pulled back by the strap of his oxygen bag. Another, a businessman with a laptop, stood halfway in the aisle, frozen in place, mouth open but silent. Oren didn't stop. He walked fast, purposeful. The emergency door loomed ahead, sealed but accessible. A red warning sign glared beside it. Authorized use only, pressurized cabin. Marcus's mind raced. The cabin wasn't depressurized. The altitude, too high. Opening that door could kill them all. Oren reached for the latch. "Stop him!" Marcus bellowed, but the male flight attendant closest to them just stared, wide-eyed, hands trembling at his sides. Another crew member stepped forward but hesitated, then turned away as if unsure whether to intervene. It was as if Oren's authority outweighed common sense. Marcus reached them just as Oren touched the handle. He grabbed the base of Ezra's cradle with both hands, yanking it back toward him. The sudden motion pulled Ezra slightly from Oren's grip, and the baby let out a shrill, frightened cry. Oren whipped around, face contorted. "He won't cry again," he hissed. Marcus's fury exploded. "Give me my son," he shouted, teeth clenched, eyes blazing. The plane jolted again, another round of turbulence shaking the overhead bins. A suitcase dislodged and fell into the aisle with a thud, startling several passengers into screams. Panic bloomed across the cabin now, thick and fast. People grabbed their armrests, others fumbled for their phones. But no one came forward. No one stopped it. The emergency door was now inches away. Oren reached with one hand toward the handle again, his other still partially clutching Ezra. Marcus lunged, colliding with the man's side, slamming them both against the panel beside the door. Ezra was wedged between their chests, crying loudly now. "Let go!" Marcus grunted, trying to pry Oren's arm free. The man was stronger than he looked. Years of working in tight cabins, perhaps. Or rage. Or something more dangerous. Oren growled, twisting violently. "This noise ends now," he spat. Ezra's tiny body shook with fear, his fists pressed against Marcus's chest. Marcus locked eyes with his son, those wide, terrified eyes that knew only comfort until now, and something inside him shifted. He was no longer just reacting. He was defending. Not just his child, but every breath, every heartbeat, every moment yet to come. He planted his feet and shoved, slamming Oren backward into the emergency door. The sound of their bodies hitting the metal was deafening. Alarms began to chime faintly from somewhere near the cockpit. Marcus didn't know if it was for altitude, door pressure, or chaos. It didn't matter. The two men grappled. Ezra was pulled back into Marcus's arms, his cries muffled against his father's chest. Marcus turned, shielding him, as Oren clawed at his back, trying to reach the handle again. The captain's voice cracked over the intercom, static-filled but urgent. "Everyone remain seated. Flight crew, what is happening back there?" But no one answered. The other attendants stood frozen, caught between policy and shock. Some passengers shouted now, "Help him! He's got a baby! Call the cockpit!" But their words seemed to bounce uselessly off the tension that wrapped the cabin like wire. Marcus braced himself against the wall, heart hammering like thunder. He looked over his shoulder. Oren's hand was inches from the emergency lever again, face blood-red with fury. One final push. Marcus turned fully, arm tightening around Ezra, and used his other to shove Oren backward with every ounce of strength left in his body. The flight attendant stumbled, caught off balance, feet slipping slightly on the floor as the plane dipped again. He crashed against the panel, arms flailing. The cradle strap slipped from his grasp. Ezra was safe. Marcus pulled back, retreating 2 steps as Oren snarled, preparing another lunge. But now passengers were moving. A man from row 12 charged forward. Another called for the air marshal, though no one knew if one was even on board. The chaos had reached its peak, and in the center of it all, Marcus stood trembling, sweat soaking his collar, arms wrapped protectively around his crying child. All around him, oxygen masks began to drop, and still no one had sealed the door. When order collapses, chaos reveals the truth. There was no hesitation, just the raw instinct of a father watching a stranger claw toward the emergency lever with a look in his eyes that no sane man should wear. Oren's fingers had already wrapped around the handle, the thick metal glinting under the dim cabin lights. Marcus's shoulder hit him squarely in the ribs, knocking the flight attendant off balance. The force sent both men crashing against the emergency exit with a bone-jarring thud. The cradle rocked violently nearby, Ezra's cries splitting through the sudden chaos like a siren. "Get off me!" Oren snarled, his voice more animal than man. Spittle flew from his lips as he twisted against Marcus's grip, his face twisted into a mask of rage. Marcus didn't respond. His teeth clenched, his mind laser-focused on one truth. If Oren succeeded in opening that door, Ezra wouldn't survive. Neither would anyone else. Every second mattered. He tightened his hold on Oren's uniform, forcing him back against the frame, but Oren thrashed like a wild creature, one arm jerking upward again toward the lever. "Not my son," Marcus growled through gritted teeth. The surrounding passengers had erupted into shouting calls for help, cries of fear, but the chaos felt distant to Marcus. A few men nearby stood, ready to intervene, but Oren's fury turned them back. He swung his elbow, catching one of them in the face. The man stumbled away, blood spurting from his nose. Another stepped forward but faltered when Oren's knee drove into Marcus's side, making him grunt in pain. Still, Marcus refused to let go. Ezra's shriek pierced the cabin again. Marcus twisted his head toward the cradle just long enough to see it sliding an inch closer toward the aisle's edge. The turbulence had worsened. Overhead bins creaked, and a sharp crack sounded as a ceiling panel popped loose. But Marcus had no time to think about it. Orrin was regaining leverage. His hand once again clawed toward the lever, fingertips brushing the base. "This noise ends now," Orrin hissed, his voice low but lethal. Marcus shoved upward, forcing Orrin's arm off course, but the attendant countered, slamming his shoulder into Marcus's chest. The breath shot from Marcus's lungs. His back hit the edge of a seat with a crack, and pain bloomed down his spine. Ezra's cries rose in pitch, desperate and sharp, filling the cabin like a warning bell. The intercom buzzed overhead. "Everyone remain seated. Stay calm." The captain's voice crackled, strained and clipped. "Cabin crew, contain the situation now." But no crew moved. The other attendants, all male, stood frozen mid-aisle. One of them, tall, blond, trembling, took a step forward before stopping, his eyes darting to Orrin and then away, as if silently pleading not to be noticed. Another crouched low, ducking behind a food cart, peeking out with wide, unblinking eyes. Marcus saw it all in the corner of his vision, understood it instantly. No help was coming. He rolled, twisting his body, and managed to wedge himself between Orrin and the door. With one arm he reached back and dragged the cradle closer to him, shielding Ezra behind his legs. The other arm remained locked in a death grip on Orrin's collar. "You're going to kill everyone," Marcus said, panting, his voice low and shaking. Orrin laughed. Not the laugh of a man caught off guard, but something darker. Measured. Cold. "Only if they fail the test," he whispered. Marcus blinked. "What test?" Before the thought could settle, Orrin surged forward again, slamming his forearm into Marcus's neck. Marcus gasped, his body arching reflexively, but he didn't let go. He couldn't. The emergency handle loomed inches from Orrin's reach again. Ezra screamed behind him, and that sound, high, desperate, and helpless, reset Marcus's strength. He surged forward. Their bodies slammed against the side of the aircraft again, this time harder. The floor shuddered beneath them. A drink tray skittered down the aisle, its metal clattering like gunfire against the seats. Passengers screamed. One man fumbled for his phone, another clutched his seatbelt so tightly his knuckles turned bone white. Orrin clawed at Marcus's face now, his nails raking across his cheek, drawing blood. But Marcus didn't flinch. He grunted, locking Orrin's arm under his own and twisting with every ounce of strength he had left. "You're not taking him," Marcus rasped. "You're not taking anyone." Their struggle tipped them dangerously close to the lever again. One of Orrin's fingers hooked underneath it. A single pull, and "No!" Marcus slammed his forearm across Orrin's face. The man's head snapped back, his hand slipping free. Marcus scooped Ezra into his arms in the same moment, the baby's cries rattling against his chest. The sudden heat of his son's body, his heartbeat, his weight, pushed something primal through Marcus's bones. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a reckoning. Orrin scrambled up, his lips drawn back into a snarl, but Marcus was ready. With Ezra shielded in one arm, he braced himself against the cabin wall and drove his knee into Orrin's chest. The attendant stumbled backward, hands flailing. Another shove, and his back hit the door. The pressure seal groaned under the weight. Marcus stepped forward. The red handle glared between them, the final threat. Orrin stared into his eyes. And in that moment, Marcus saw something terrifying. Not fear, not regret, but satisfaction. Like the chaos had been enough. Like even failure was a win. That realization chilled Marcus to the bone. This man hadn't snapped. He had planned it. Every motion, every gesture, it had all been deliberate. Marcus shifted his grip on Ezra and shouted to the nearest passenger, "Pull the cradle back!" A man obeyed instantly, dragging the seat cradle toward safety. Orrin took that split second to lunge one last time, but Marcus met him head-on. Their bodies collided again, and Marcus pinned him to the door, muscles straining. The red handle trembled between them, inches from both sets of fingers. Marcus didn't blink. "The fight is over," he said, but Orrin only smiled. The line between fear and fury snapped in a single motion. The emergency lock disengaged with a brutal clang, and in the same instant, a deafening roar erupted inside the cabin as the emergency exit blasted open. The world tilted violently. Wind screamed through the breach like a living thing, slamming overhead compartments open and tearing loose safety cards, magazines, and napkins, which spun through the air like panicked birds. Oxygen masks dropped in a tangled tangle from above, jerking and flailing in the chaos. Passengers screamed, some ducking, others gripping armrests with white-knuckled fists. The plane jolted, its body groaning as pressure shifted. Marcus didn't think. He reacted. His left arm was clamped tight around Ezra, the baby wailing against his chest, tiny fists clutching his shirt. His right hand snatched for a seat frame, knuckles smashing into the metal as he locked his grip. The wind tugged at him with relentless force, threatening to rip father and son from their seats and into the sky. His cheeks stung from the sudden drop in pressure. His ears roared with more than just noise. They rang with instinct, terror, fury. Orrin Vance stood by the open exit, eyes wide with something close to victory. Twisted, manic victory. The wind caught his uniform, flattening it to his skin like a second trembling layer. He leaned into the gale, face carved with something dark and satisfied, one hand still on the exit frame. Marcus's gaze locked with his. The question burned behind his eyes. What kind of man does this? There was no room for answers. Only choices. "You brought this on yourself," Marcus muttered, barely hearing his own voice. He shifted his weight, bracing his legs against the bolted seat in front of him. Every movement was a battle. The floor shuddered. Loose items flew past his head. A travel bag slapped a window with a sickening thud. Then Orrin moved. He lunged forward, his hand reaching toward Marcus's shoulder like a hook, trying to pry Ezra away. "This ends now," Orrin bellowed, his voice a whip of hatred tangled in wind. Marcus snapped. He twisted, using the strength he didn't know he had. With one smooth, brutal motion, he pivoted his hips, driving Orrin sideways toward the open door. Orrin shouted, stumbling as his foot slipped on the carpet now flapping in gusts. Marcus didn't let go of Ezra. He didn't scream. He didn't hesitate. He rammed his shoulder into Orrin's chest like a battering ram. The impact sent both men crashing into the narrow aisle. A man in the next row ducked just in time as Orrin's body slammed into the seat, then bounced sideways. The howling wind snatched at him, pulling his feet off the floor. He reached out wildly, clawing at the exit frame. For a moment, his fingers gripped it, holding him halfway between life and the open sky. "Help!" Orrin shrieked, the triumph gone, replaced by sheer panic. His eyes, once cold and calculating, were now wide and terrified. Marcus took 2 steps forward, every inch a struggle against the vacuum behind him. He placed himself between Orrin and his son, between chaos and survival. "You wanted the door open?" he shouted over the storm. "Then face it yourself." He lunged forward again, using the seatback for leverage. With a burst of power, he grabbed Orrin by the collar and spun, dragging the man closer to the howling void. Orrin kicked. He screamed. He begged. His fingers clung to anything, armrests, seatbelts, even Marcus's forearm. But Marcus had made his decision. This wasn't vengeance. This was protection. His muscles burned. His legs threatened to buckle. But Ezra was still crying, still alive in his arms, and that was all that mattered. He pulled one final time, slamming Orrin's shoulder against the metal edge of the open door. The flight attendant's scream was swallowed by the wind. For a heartbeat, it looked like he might be pulled through, might take Marcus with him. Then, somehow, Marcus twisted just enough. Orrin's balance shifted. He slid. His hand slipped off the frame. The wind claimed him. Gone. The cabin fell into a stunned silence, if such a thing could exist amid roaring air and swaying walls. All eyes were on Marcus, the man holding his son in one arm, gripping the seat rail with the other, sweat and tears and steel carved into his expression. The wind still raged. The emergency exit still yawned open. But Orrin Vance was gone, and Marcus Delroy was still standing. "You wanted the door open? Then face it yourself." The roar of the wind tore through the cabin like a scream from the earth itself. Loose papers flew like startled birds, overhead compartments rattled, and the oxygen masks dangled like pendulums of panic. Marcus Delroy stood between life and the void, one arm wrapped around his infant son, Ezra, the other braced against the frame of a seat, shoving with everything he had. Orrin Vance, the flight attendant who only minutes ago had tried to throw Ezra from the aircraft, was now the one at the mercy of the open sky. The emergency exit yawned like a monster's mouth, hungry and endless. A vacuum of air surged through it, threatening to rip everything from the plane. The passengers clung to armrests and seatbacks, some screaming, others too shocked to speak. A man in the rear row had his tie pulled so violently by the wind that it wrapped around his face. A food tray whipped past like a blade. Every second felt like an eternity. Yet in the eye of that storm stood Marcus, his knees bent, body trembling, heart pounding in his ears louder than the engines outside. Ezra whimpered against his chest, his tiny hands clinging to Marcus's shirt, his soft cry nearly drowned in the wind. Marcus lowered his head briefly, forehead pressed to Ezra's, grounding himself in the child's warmth. He could feel the baby's heart racing. The fear in Ezra's breath wasn't imagined. It was real, and it strengthened Marcus's resolve. With a grunt, he shifted his weight forward again, pressing his shoulder into Oren's chest. The man flailed, his polished shoes skidding against the metal floor, fingernails scraping across seat backs and armrests in a last-ditch effort to anchor himself. Gone was the cold precision, the twisted pride that had driven him to madness. Now his eyes screamed the truth. Oren didn't want justice. He didn't want peace. He wanted control. And now, stripped of it, he looked no different than the chaos he'd unleashed. "You don't get to decide who lives," Marcus growled through clenched teeth, muscles straining against the gale. His voice wasn't loud. He couldn't afford to open his mouth too wide, but it carried the weight of fury. Oren didn't reply. He couldn't. His mouth opened in what might have been a plea, but the wind tore the words from his throat. His hand shot out, grabbing Marcus's sleeve. For a horrifying instant, Marcus lost balance. The world tilted. His heel slipped against a slick patch of floor. The grip on the seat loosened. Wind surged beneath him like a wave lifting a boat. He twisted, turning his back against the storm, using his body like a shield for Ezra. In that second, it would have been so easy to let go, to give in to gravity and chaos and hope something softer came after. But his mind rebelled. Not like this. A memory crashed into his thoughts, Ezra's first laugh. That hiccuping, toothless sound during a diaper change when Marcus had made a stupid face. It wasn't heroic, it wasn't profound, but it had been theirs, and that memory lit a fire in him nothing could blow out. With a guttural cry, he anchored his foot against the seat base and shoved. Oren skidded backward. One of his feet caught on a seat frame, halting his fall. The tension snapped like a cord. Marcus stumbled forward with the force of his own push, catching himself just inches from the exit. Wind clawed at him, dragging at his clothes, his skin, trying to pry Ezra from his arms. But he curled around his son like armor, back arched, arms locked. Oren screamed again, not words, but instinct. He reached out, fingers groping, and for a breathless second Marcus thought he might grab someone else, another passenger, a loose bag, a coat sleeve, but no one was close enough. They were all frozen in place, trapped in their own cages of fear. Behind him, Marcus heard the heavy clatter of movement, someone or something, trying to help, trying to survive. But he couldn't turn, couldn't risk shifting his weight. "Stay with me, Ezra," he whispered, his voice nearly lost to the howl. "Just a little longer." He looked again at Oren, still wedged by the foot, face wild, hands trembling. The man was seconds from either salvation or the storm. And Marcus knew the cruel truth. One false move could doom them all. If Oren regained footing, he might lunge again. If Marcus hesitated, he might lose control. His shoulder throbbed, his legs shook, but his resolve stayed firm. A hand reached toward him. Someone from the row behind, but it never connected. A suitcase broke free and slammed into the opposite wall, the impact startling enough to draw gasps from the cabin. Oren shrieked again, his hands flailing for grip. Marcus had no more time. He dug deep into the last reserves of strength, pressing his foot harder, surging forward with everything he had. Oren slipped. His shoe tore free. For a split second, their eyes locked, one filled with hatred, the other with fire. And then Oren fell. The scream was snatched by the wind before it fully left his mouth. His body vanished into the open sky like a leaf lost in a storm. The sudden silence that followed was more chilling than the noise, just the eerie howl of the open exit and the rattling of the plane. Marcus staggered back, panting, sweat pouring down his face despite the cold. Ezra wailed in his arms, alive, whole, safe. The father's heart beat like a war drum beneath his ribs. Around him, men exhaled shakily, some collapsing into seats, others still too stunned to speak. Marcus turned slowly, his body aching, the wind still pulling at his clothes. The exit remained wide open. Danger still loomed. But for now, the threat was gone. He gritted his teeth and whispered more to himself than anyone else, When the sky opens, choices cut sharper than knives. Oren's hand clamped around Marcus's arm with terrifying force, dragging him toward the howling mouth of the emergency exit. The wind screamed through the cabin, tugging at clothes, papers, and loose bags, but Marcus had no time to process the chaos. Ezra's cries rang sharp in his ear, the sound thin and desperate over the roar. The baby's tiny fists beat weakly against Marcus's chest as he fought to keep his balance, feet scraping against the metal floor, seeking something, anything, to hold on to. Oren's face was twisted in a mask of fury, not just anger but something deeper, something cracked. His eyes bulged with the strain of his grip, veins pulsing at his temples. He wasn't just trying to escape, he was trying to take Marcus and Ezra with him. "Let go!" Marcus bellowed, his voice almost swallowed by the rushing air. But Oren didn't respond. His mouth was open, teeth clenched, eyes locked with a desperation that ignored reason. This wasn't about discipline or protocol anymore. This was madness. Marcus's back hit the edge of the doorframe, a cold jolt of pain reminding him how close they were to the edge of death. One slip, one breath taken too late, one weakened muscle, that's all it would take. His body trembled under the strain of Oren's pull. Ezra's carrier strap bit into his shoulder as the wind tried to tear the child away. 1,000 thoughts collided in Marcus's mind: how to shift his weight, how to counter Oren's grip, how to protect Ezra without losing himself. For a split second, his mind flickered to a different place. The hospital room, soft lighting, the scent of antiseptic and lavender lotion. Ezra's first smile, gummy and bright. That tiny moment, so full of life, flared inside him like a spark catching dry grass. He couldn't let this end here. He wouldn't. Marcus inhaled sharply, bent his knees, and with everything he had left, he twisted his body. Oren's grip slipped as Marcus dropped low, yanked free of the hand pulling him back, and then surged forward like a battering ram. His shoulder connected with Oren's chest, and the force knocked the wind out of both of them. Oren stumbled, his foot catching the edge of the door, his scream lost in the wind. "No!" Oren roared, one hand flailing for balance, the other trying to grip Marcus again. But there was nothing to hold on to. The cabin pitched slightly as the pilot adjusted altitude, and in that moment the balance shifted. Oren's body tilted back, weightless for a second, suspended between sky and steel. Marcus reached out instinctively, not out of mercy, but out of reflex. Yet his fingers barely brushed Oren's wrist before the man was ripped away by the wind. His uniform fluttered like a torn flag as he disappeared into the roaring blue beyond. A collective gasp shuddered through the cabin. For a second, it felt like time had stopped. The wind still screamed, masks still dangled, and the exit still yawned open like a mouth mid-scream. But inside that moment, there was silence. Marcus staggered back, feet barely catching under him, heart hammering so hard he thought it might crack his ribs. He clutched Ezra to his chest, both arms wrapped tight, his lips pressing to the top of the baby's head. Ezra cried but was safe, alive. The warmth of his son's body steadied Marcus more than the floor beneath his feet. He turned slowly, scanning the faces around him, faces stunned, terrified, some with eyes wide and mouths agape, others shaking their heads in disbelief. None of them spoke. Marcus's breath came in gasps. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. His hands trembled, but not with fear. He had gone beyond that. What pulsed through him now was something else. Resolve, the kind that only came from facing death and refusing to blink. He sank to one knee beside an empty row, cradling Ezra in the crook of his elbow, eyes still fixed on the door, the way the air screamed through it like a siren warning that more was coming. Someone shouted for the door to be shut. Another man rushed forward to help. The cabin was moving again. But for Marcus, the moment had solidified. The world had split open at 30,000 feet, and he had stared into it, and survived. The sky claimed the predator, but the battle was far from over. He tried to hurl a black infant out the emergency door, thinking silence would protect him. If you believe every act of cruelty must face justice, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The roar of wind tore through the cabin like a beast unleashed, drowning out cries, commands, and even thought itself. The emergency exit gaped open like a wound in the aircraft's side, letting in the sky with a fury no one could have prepared for. Marcus Delroy staggered backward, his arms wrapped tightly around Ezra. The baby's body pressed so close to his chest he could feel every panicked heartbeat. His own lungs fought for air as the vacuum threatened to tear everything loose. The overhead compartments rattled, a suitcase tumbled, and the oxygen masks swayed violently like pendulums counting down to disaster. "Hold on!" someone shouted, but the voice was whipped away almost instantly. Two men, passengers, hurried down the aisle toward Marcus. One was in a tan business suit, his tie fluttering over his shoulder like a flag in a storm. The other wore a faded flannel shirt and gripped the backs of seats with white-knuckled hands as he moved. Neither hesitated. They dropped low to keep balance, eyes wide but focused. Together, they reached the open door, their backs braced against the wall, and began to tug at the emergency lever, straining to seal the breach. "It won't budge," the man in flannel shouted, gritting his teeth as the wind howled into his face. Marcus crouched beside them, Ezra still clutched in one arm. His eyes scanned the chaos, the aisle strewn with plastic cups, torn magazines, an overturned food cart, and then he saw it. A heavy beverage cart, toppled during the earlier struggle, lay jammed against the aisle wall several rows behind them. "There," Marcus pointed, raising his voice above the wind. "That cart. We can use it to block the airflow." The man in the suit glanced back, hesitation flashing across his face, but then he nodded. "Let's move." The three of them scrambled. Marcus passed Ezra briefly to the man in flannel, who tucked the baby securely against his chest as if he understood, without words, that this child's safety was everything. Marcus and the man in the suit bent low and wrestled with the fallen cart, the metal wheels shrieking as they forced it upright. It was heavier than it looked, stocked with bottles, cans, and the weight of desperation. With muscles burning and the cabin pitching slightly beneath their feet, they dragged the cart forward, inch by inch, toward the open exit. The wind fought them with every step, screaming through the fuselage, trying to shove them back. But Marcus's jaw was clenched, his vision narrowed to a single focus. Protect his son. Protect them all. They reached the door. The man in flannel handed Ezra back carefully, his hands trembling now that the adrenaline had begun to fade. Marcus took his son and turned his body, shielding Ezra from the wind as the other two shoved the cart against the breach. The noise dulled slightly, the metal frame of the cart blocking the worst of the gale. It wasn't a seal, but it was something. "For now," the man in the suit panted, holding the cart in place with his shoulder. "It'll buy us time." The intercom crackled. The captain's voice came through, strained and uneven. "This is your captain. Hold tight. We're making an emergency descent." Marcus exhaled slowly, sweat pouring down his face, his hair plastered to his forehead. Around him, the passengers were still in chaos, some sobbing, others frozen, many just gripping their armrests with closed eyes and clenched jaws. The oxygen masks danced above them like ghosts. Marcus looked down at Ezra, whose eyes were closed, face red, mouth open in a silent, exhausted cry. His tiny fingers gripped the collar of his father's shirt. "You're okay," Marcus whispered, brushing the back of the baby's head. "I've got you." But even as he said it, his mind reeled with everything that had just happened. Oren was gone, dragged into the sky. The emergency exit had nearly pulled them all to their deaths. And now, though the worst seemed over, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something about this attack, about Oren, wasn't random. There had been too much intent, too much control in the madness. He tucked that thought away for now. It wasn't time for questions yet. It was time to survive. The wind still whistled through the narrow cracks around the makeshift barricade. The passengers remained huddled, hushed now, staring at Marcus not just with fear, but with awe. Some of them nodded slowly, acknowledging him. A few even whispered, "Thank you." But Marcus didn't nod back. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a father who'd barely outrun the jaws of something bigger than any of them yet understood. He stared at the blocked exit, then at the blinking red light above it. This wasn't over. Not yet. Even when one battle ends, the war against fear continues. The plane dropped hard. Not a slow descent, but a sudden, brutal jolt that sent overhead compartments flying open and startled gasps ripping through the cabin. Trays clattered, coffee splashed, and one man's glasses flew from his face, skidding across the aisle. Marcus gripped the armrest with one hand and held Ezra tighter with the other, feeling the full weight of his child pressed into his chest. The seatbelt harness dug into his shoulder as the aircraft pitched again, this time with a violent shudder that made every soul on board understand just how close they were to disaster. Across the row, a passenger clutched a cross necklace and whispered prayers under his breath. Another rocked back and forth, muttering incoherently, while a third man beside the window buried his face in his hands, shoulders trembling. The lights flickered, dimmed, then came back weakly as if the plane itself was trying not to lose consciousness. Marcus glanced around, adrenaline keeping his senses painfully sharp. Ezra whimpered softly, his small hands clutching at his father's shirt. "It's okay, little man," Marcus murmured, pressing his lips to Ezra's forehead. "We're going to get through this." His voice was steady, but inside his thoughts churned like a storm. His engineer's mind clung to calculations, air pressure, descent rate, cabin integrity, but it wasn't enough to silence the deeper question clawing at him. Why had Oren done it? Marcus could still see the look in the flight attendant's eyes. It hadn't been a breakdown. It hadn't been panic or stress or rage. It had been something colder, calculated, as if Oren knew exactly what he was doing, as if the madness was just a mask for something far more deliberate. He hadn't just acted on impulse, he had followed a plan that involved endangering not just a baby, but every passenger on board. Marcus tightened his grip on Ezra, the memory of Oren's twisted expression refusing to fade. The pieces didn't fit, not yet, but they pointed to something worse than a single man's collapse. It was the way Oren had waited, choosing the moment of turbulence, the way he'd moved quickly, confidently, the certainty in his actions. Marcus had solved countless complex systems in his line of work, but now he felt himself piecing together something more dangerous than any code, a pattern of intent behind an act of terror. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, breathless and urgent. "This is your captain speaking. We are in emergency descent. I repeat, emergency descent. All passengers remain seated and brace for landing. I assure you, we are doing everything possible to keep the plane stable." The cabin moaned under strain. Screws creaked, panels vibrated. The air inside was thin, cold, filled with the sound of labored breathing and quiet sobs. Ezra whimpered again, louder this time. Marcus rocked gently, whispering comfort, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. What if this wasn't over? He looked toward the front of the plane where other attendants moved frantically. Some were helping passengers, but others looked frozen, lost in shock. The crew wasn't unified. They weren't following protocol. It reminded him of something else, when the system fails not because of chaos, but because of design. A man across the aisle suddenly shouted, "What if someone else is part of it?" His voice was high, cracked with fear. What if he wasn't alone? Several heads turned, eyes widened. Paranoia leaked through the cabin like gas. Marcus didn't answer aloud, but inside the thought hit him like a hammer. What if Oren wasn't the only one? The man had tried to throw a baby out of an airplane. That wasn't just malice, it was insanity with purpose. Marcus's stomach turned as his mind returned to Oren's words. "This noise ends now." Not, "I can't take it." Not, "Make him stop crying." It was something broader, symbolic. Ezra stirred again, his voice cracking into a thin cry. Marcus bounced gently, his hands moving with instinctual care, but his eyes never stopped scanning the cabin. "Hold on," a voice from behind muttered. "We're almost down." "God help us," said another. But Marcus wasn't waiting on help. He was analyzing. The pressure, the people, the implications. What if this flight wasn't a freak event? What if it was a test? The thought settled heavy in his chest. Maybe Oren had wanted to be stopped. Maybe the goal wasn't success. It was the reaction. How many passengers panicked? Who froze? Who acted? A live experiment in fear. The idea chilled him more than the altitude. If this was a test, who was watching? Another drop yanked the plane downward. Screams filled the cabin. The seatbelt sign blinked red, and Ezra's cry became a full wail. Marcus curled protectively, shielding his son as best he could. He didn't see the runway yet, didn't feel the drag of landing gear, only the relentless descent. Then, for a brief moment, there was stillness, a lull, the kind before impact. Marcus braced, every muscle tight, the cradle pressed to his chest like a shield against the world. He didn't think of statistics or odds. He thought of Ezra's first smile, of the way the boy laughed when he saw ceiling fans, of soft mornings and lullabies and the promise he'd made to always protect him. They weren't going to die today. Not like this. Not in someone else's experiment. The plane dropped again, harder, sharper. The roar of tires on tarmac hadn't come yet. The storm was still raging. Marcus closed his eyes, lips at his son's ear. "We're going to make it." And then, faint and trembling, the thought echoed again. This wasn't random. His jaw clenched. He would find out why. He would uncover everything. Not for vengeance, but for truth. Because if Oren was part of something bigger, then others might try again. And, next time, it might not be him on the plane. When madness looks like purpose, danger waits beyond the fall. The plane slammed onto the runway with a jolt that sent trays rattling and passengers gasping. Tires screeched, metal groaned, and for a moment it felt as if the whole aircraft might splinter apart. Marcus gritted his teeth, one hand wrapped protectively around Ezra's tiny body, the other braced against the seat in front of him. The baby whimpered softly, but he was alive, safe in his father's arms. Outside the window, bright red fire trucks and flashing blue lights raced alongside the plane, their sirens silent but urgent, like guardians arriving too late. The aircraft jerked to a halt. Silence, brief and stunned, fell over the cabin. Then the sound returned, first in gasps, then sobs, and finally cheers. Some passengers applauded, some broke down, and others just stared ahead in dazed disbelief. Marcus barely moved. His arms were locked around Ezra, and his mind was still trying to slow from the chaos he had just lived through. The air felt thinner, the space tighter. Sweat rolled down his temples. He could still hear the wind howling in his ears even though the exit was closed now. Emergency crews burst onto the plane through the front entrance. Men in neon vests and heavy boots shouted orders, their faces tight with urgency. One paramedic crouched by Marcus's row, checking him for injuries, but Marcus shook his head. "Help the others first," he said, his voice raw and low. "We're okay." A tall man in uniform pushed through the aisle. His silver pilot's wings glinted under the cabin lights, but his eyes were dark with something heavier than stress. Captain Rylan Cord. He was a veteran in the skies, with a reputation for control under pressure. Yet now, that calm exterior was cracking. He stopped beside Marcus, leaned down, and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Delroy," he said, eyes flicking around the cabin before meeting Marcus's. "I need a moment of your time, privately." Marcus looked down at Ezra, then back at the captain. "Is this about Oren?" Captain Cord gave a slight nod, his jaw tightening. "Yes. Please, come with me." Marcus rose carefully, still clutching his son. The weight of Ezra against his chest was both grounding and overwhelming. Every step down the narrow aisle felt like walking a tightrope above something terrible. The crew parted as he passed, some with looks of admiration, others with guilt in their eyes. No one spoke. In the galley near the cockpit, the captain closed the curtain behind them. The air was quieter here, but the tension was thicker. "There's something you need to know," Cord said. "Something I couldn't say in front of the others." Marcus shifted his stance, adjusting Ezra in his arms. "Go ahead." Cord hesitated, then spoke. Oren Vance wasn't just some unstable crew member. He was under investigation by an internal security task force, one I was quietly working with. We'd received anonymous reports about his behavior, strange conversations, unexplained absences, encrypted communications. Marcus's heart thudded harder. Why was he still flying? "We didn't have enough to ground him yet. The union, the paperwork. We were trying to build a stronger case first," Cord admitted, his voice low and ashamed. "But now, I think we were too late." Marcus stared at him, trying to absorb the weight of the words. "There's more," the captain continued. "Those reports mentioned a group, something called the Halveth Circle. Not much is known about them, but their interest seems to be psychological warfare. Fear, stress under extreme conditions. They've been linked to staged emergencies, manipulated panic, and now, we believe, this." Marcus stepped back, gripping Ezra tighter as his stomach turned. "You're saying this wasn't a breakdown?" "No," Cord said, shaking his head grimly. "It was a test. You and Ezra weren't targets of rage. You were variables in an experiment." The word experiment felt like ice in Marcus's veins. He remembered the way Oren moved with purpose, the eerie calm before the storm, the muttering about distractions, the refusal to be stopped. It all made a sick kind of sense now. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. "Because they might try again," Cord said, "and because you survived it. You stopped it. You deserve to know what you're part of now." Marcus looked at Ezra, the baby now sleeping, unaware of how close the sky had come to stealing him away. Outside, he could hear reporters shouting through the terminal, news crews, flashing cameras. The word hero was being thrown around like confetti. But Marcus didn't feel like one. Not yet. "What happens next?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Cord admitted, "but I think this is bigger than we imagined." Marcus stared past the curtain, past the chaos and relief, and into the fog of questions still forming in his mind. There would be investigations, headlines, public statements. But deep underneath, something darker had been awakened, and he had been thrown straight into it. He had survived a madman in the sky, but something told him the true danger had only just begun. Holding Ezra tightly, Marcus realized that his fight had only just begun. Sometimes survival is only the prologue to the real war. The emergency door slammed shut behind Marcus as he stepped off the plane, his legs aching with exhaustion, his arms still locked around Ezra. Blinding red and white lights pulsed across the tarmac as fire crews swarmed the aircraft, voices crackling over radios, boots thudding against the pavement. Thick, acrid air clung to everything: fuel, metal, sweat, fear. Paramedics rushed forward, their gloved hands reaching for Ezra first. Marcus hesitated, his grip instinctive and fierce before finally loosening his hold. He watched as they checked his son's breathing, heart rate, and reflexes with practiced urgency. Inside the terminal, the chaos only multiplied. Reporters pressed against security barricades, shouting questions, holding up microphones, phones, anything that could capture a glimpse of the man now being called the hero father. Flashbulbs popped. A sea of noise washed over Marcus, cheers, questions, confusion, but his mind remained fixed on the captain's final words. He was under investigation. This wasn't random. He scanned the crowd and caught sight of two men in dark suits standing near the security checkpoint. They weren't filming. They weren't panicking. They were watching him, closely. One whispered something to the other and began moving in his direction. Marcus stood taller, instinctively shielding Ezra with his body. The man approached with an air of authority, though his steps were slow, deliberate. "Mr. Delroy?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. "My name is Alden Crail. I'm with the National Transit Bureau. May I speak with you privately?" Marcus's eyes narrowed. "About what?" Alden glanced briefly at the camera crews behind them, then back at Marcus. "Not here, but it's important. You and your son may still be in danger." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Marcus nodded stiffly, his voice low. "Lead the way." They were taken to a secured office off the main terminal, a sterile, windowless room with 2 chairs and a metal desk. Ezra whimpered softly, sensing the tension. Marcus rocked him gently, whispering quiet reassurances. Alden closed the door behind them, locking it with a coated panel before taking a seat across from Marcus. "You did more than survive today," Alden began, his fingers steepled. "You interrupted something much bigger than one unstable crew member." Marcus didn't speak, waiting. Alden continued. "Orrin Vance wasn't acting alone. He's been on our radar for months. We suspected he was connected to a covert group operating under the name Halveth Circle. Until now, we couldn't prove it." Marcus's jaw clenched. "And what is this circle supposed to be?" "A think tank, but not the academic kind," Alden said grimly. "They believe fear is the purest form of human response. They stage events, controlled chaos, to observe how people react under pressure, accidents, system failures, even deliberate threats to children." Marcus tightened his grip around Ezra. "You're telling me my son was targeted for some twisted experiment?" "Not targeted personally," Alden said quickly, "but used, yes. Orrin selected you. You were traveling alone, a father with a young child. Vulnerable, but capable. They wanted to see what it would take for a man to break or fight." Marcus's thoughts spun. The cold looks, the glares, the calculated cruelty. None of it had been random. "And now you're a witness, and that makes you valuable to us and dangerous to them." Marcus leaned forward, voice low and steady. "You said I might still be in danger. What aren't you telling me?" Alden hesitated, then pulled out a folder. Inside were surveillance photos, Orrin speaking with other unidentified men in quiet corners of airports, diagrams of flight patterns, and maps marked with coded symbols. Some images showed children, families. "We've only scratched the surface," Alden admitted. "We don't know how many members they have or how high it goes, but we know this. Flight 732 wasn't the end. It was a test run." The room fell silent, broken only by Ezra's small breaths. Marcus looked down at his son, peaceful now, unaware of how close he had come to the unthinkable. His heart pounded with rage, not just at Oren, but at the invisible machine that had put them on that plane together. "What do you need from me?" "We need you to stay protected. Lay low for now. We'll assign a security detail, relocate you temporarily, but eventually, we may need your testimony." Marcus stood slowly. "Testimony won't be enough." Alden raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm not just going to sit and wait for them to come back. If this circle is real, if they're still out there, I want to help stop them." Alden studied him carefully, then gave a slow nod. "You're not the first to say that, but you may be the first who actually can." Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. The fire in his eyes had already answered for him. He lifted Ezra into his arms again, cradling him with a tenderness that belied the storm inside him. The father, who had nearly been torn from the sky, was still standing, but he knew the real descent was only beginning. As Alden opened the door and the harsh light of the corridor spilled in, Marcus stepped forward, each movement deliberate. When the ground feels unsteady, the fall never truly ends. The door clicked shut behind Marcus with a cold finality, cutting him off from the voices, flashing lights, and chaos of the terminal. The room was dimly lit, sterile and silent save for the soft hum of overhead ventilation. Ezra stirred in his arms but remained asleep, his small face peaceful, unaware of how close he had come to being lost. Marcus sat down slowly, his muscles aching from the strain of the descent, his arms still locked protectively around his son. Across the table sat Alden Crail, stone-faced, eyes heavy with something deeper than fatigue. Without a word, Alden opened a manila folder and spread out the contents like puzzle pieces. There were surveillance photos of Oren Vance, some at airports, others in unmarked buildings, and behavioral reports littered with red ink. Certain lines were blacked out, names and operations buried beneath thick censorship. One image in particular caught Marcus's eye. Oren, seated in a diner, speaking to two men in identical charcoal suits, their faces turned just slightly from the camera. The timestamp was dated 3 months before the flight. "This isn't just a rogue employee losing his mind," Alden said, his voice low, steady. "Oren was recruited." Marcus tightened his grip on Ezra, shifting him gently in his arms. "Recruited by who?" Alden pulled out a final document and slid it across the table. The page bore a single name at the top in block letters, the Halveth Circle. Below it, phrases like psychological volatility induction, civilian stress analytics, and threshold breach events were scattered among the redactions. "They're a clandestine group," Alden continued, his gaze unwavering. "We've been tracking whispers of them for years. They don't want money, they don't want to hijack planes or gain fame. They want data, real-time, unfiltered data about fear, panic, breakdown. They infiltrate systems, airlines, hospitals, even schools, just to study what happens when the structure collapses." Marcus's mind reeled. The weight of the truth crashed down with a force more violent than turbulence. He had nearly lost his son, not because of a man's anger, but because of an experiment, because someone in a room like this had wanted to see how he would respond. The rage that filled him was unlike anything he had felt before. It wasn't loud, it wasn't fiery, it was silent and cold, rising from the pit of his stomach like ice water, chilling his bones as it climbed. "They used us," Marcus said quietly, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "They put Ezra in danger, just to see what I'd do." Alden nodded solemnly. "We believe Oren was supposed to provoke a reaction, not necessarily succeed. The data they wanted was in your panic, your choices, the chain reaction inside that cabin. But you didn't fall apart, Marcus. You acted, and now they know your name." A silence stretched between them, thick with realization. Outside the room, the world was already turning Marcus into a symbol, a hero, a headline. But here, within these four walls, he was being marked as something else, a liability, a witness, maybe even a threat to the ones who had orchestrated the chaos. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, eyes still locked on the photograph of Oren. Alden leaned forward, folding his hands. "Now, we try to dismantle what we can. But they're shadows, Marcus, and shadows don't like to be exposed. You've survived something they intended to stay secret. That puts a target on your back." Marcus looked down at Ezra, his tiny chest rising and falling against his own. The infant's hands were curled into soft fists, his head resting beneath his father's chin. How close had he come to being lost to the sky, to becoming a number in some deranged study? His heart ached at the thought. His mind, however, had already moved forward. The engineer in him, the problem solver, had awakened. "Then I can't just go home and pretend it didn't happen," Marcus said. "I won't." Alden didn't argue. He simply nodded, quietly placing a burner phone and a card with a secure line number on the table. "We'll be in touch. For now, stay quiet and stay alert. You're not just a father anymore. You're a witness, and they erase witnesses." Marcus stood slowly, careful not to wake Ezra. He looked once more at the photos, then at Alden. "I don't want protection," Marcus said, his voice firm. "I want to understand what we're really up against." Alden's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes acknowledged the resolve in front of him. "You'll get your answers," he replied, "but they won't come easy." Marcus turned toward the door. The hallway beyond was empty, quiet, too quiet. Every step out of that room would now carry weight. He knew the Halveth Circle was still watching. He knew they might come again. But he also knew something else. He would be ready. He had to be. He looked down at his son, still fast asleep despite the world shaking around him. That was the last moment he allowed himself to tremble. A father's choice is never retreat, it is defiance. The word threshold echoed in Marcus's ears as he sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the redacted file Alden had just placed in front of him. The air conditioner hummed above them, barely cutting the stale tension that pressed down like a second ceiling. The document was thin, just a handful of pages with most lines blacked out, but the words that remained struck harder than any full report ever could. "Exit that reveals truth," Marcus read aloud, his voice low and steady, though his fingers tightened on the edges of the page. They weren't just trying to scare people. They wanted to study how they broke. Alden Crail, seated across the table, leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His eyes were sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, the kind that made him look more like a teacher than an investigator. But his posture told another story. Tense, guarded, alert. "Oren was never expected to succeed," he said quietly. "The Circle doesn't want casualties. They want reactions. Fear is the data." Marcus leaned back slowly, the chair creaking beneath him. His mind replayed the moment Oren had reached for the emergency lever, the look of cold certainty in his eyes, the methodical way he had moved. It hadn't been a breakdown. It had been a demonstration. "Every movement he made was calculated," Marcus muttered. "He didn't just want Ezra gone. He wanted everyone on that flight to feel it, to witness it." Alden nodded grimly. "That's their pattern. Isolate, provoke, observe." The room fell silent for a moment, broken only by the rustle of another file being opened. Marcus scanned the page. There were fragments of communication, emails, encrypted messages, even physical notes recovered from Oren's locker. Phrases repeated like a mantra. "Fear sharpens awareness. Threshold of collective panic. Test the arc of instinct." Marcus's chest tightened. "How many more of these experiments are they planning?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Alden replied, his tone colder now. "But they're smart. They don't move in patterns we can easily track, and they've already gone quiet since the incident." The words weighed heavy. Marcus's mind raced, his engineer's brain cycling through variables, outcomes, points of failure. He had spent his career designing systems meant to withstand stress, networks, algorithms, solutions that thrived under pressure. But now the system being tested was humanity itself. "Let me help," Marcus said, his voice firmer now. "Don't just use me as a witness. Let me build something, track them, expose them, anything. I can't just sit and wait while another family gets targeted." Alden raised an eyebrow. "You're a father, Marcus. You already did more than most. You don't owe anyone more." "I owe Ezra everything," Marcus replied, eyes burning with determination. "And if I can stop one more parent from holding their baby in the middle of a nightmare, then I'm not done." Alden was quiet for a long moment, then finally nodded. "There's a name. A contact. Someone who left the Circle years ago. We've been trying to find him. He might be your way in." Marcus's heartbeat quickened. "What's his name?" Alden hesitated, then slid a card across the table. It was plain, no title, no logo, just a name and a number scribbled in tight, sharp handwriting. Caleb Strainer. He was one of their data architects. knows how they think. If anyone can tell us where they'll strike next, it's him." Marcus tucked the card into his jacket pocket, already making plans. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. This wasn't about a single flight or a single act of madness. It was about an idea, a belief that fear was a tool, that panic could be measured like temperature, that human lives were just variables in a grotesque equation. And somewhere out there, another flight was boarding. Another father was settling his child into a cradle, unaware that eyes were already watching. Marcus stood, Ezra's picture still tucked in his wallet. He would not run. He would not retreat. He would build, fight, and expose them, piece by calculated piece. When truth hides in riddles, resolve becomes the only key. Marcus stood beneath the white glow of overhead spotlights, his suit crisp, but his eyes shadowed by the weight of what he was about to do. The tribunal chamber was cold, austere, lined with dark walnut panels and ringed by silent observers whose pens hovered over legal pads like swords waiting to strike. A row of government officials sat behind polished desks, their expressions unreadable. Before them was the man who had survived what no one should have survived, and today he wasn't there to recount a tragedy. He was there to ignite change. "State your name for the record," one of the officials asked. "Marcus Delroy," he replied, his voice calm but edged with fire. "Systems engineer, father, survivor of Skyward Air Flight 732. The silence that followed was heavy with expectation. To his left, Alden Crail stood rigid in a charcoal-gray suit, his eyes scanning the tribunal panel for any sign of resistance. The investigator gave a small nod, just enough to say, "You're not alone." Marcus took a deep breath and opened the folder in front of him. Inside were printed emails, surveillance stills, and personnel files stamped with official seals. On the top page, in bold black lettering, Orrin Vance, classified materials. "I'm not here to relive the terror that happened on that flight," Marcus began, his voice resonating through the chamber. "I'm here to expose the system that allowed it to happen." The room stirred. A few members of the press leaned forward, cameras flashing from behind the glass barrier at the back. Marcus held up one document, an internal memo dated 2 months before the incident. "This memo," he said, "shows that Orrin Vance was already under investigation for psychological instability, but more importantly, it links him to a covert group known as the Halveth Circle, a network of individuals who believe fear is a tool for progress, not destruction." Gasps rippled across the chamber. The lead official, a stern man named Raymond Thorne, raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Delroy, are you saying this attack was orchestrated?" "I'm saying it was intentional," Marcus replied, fire building in his tone. "Not in the way you might expect, not to kill, but to observe. Orrin wasn't trying to bring the plane down. He was trying to trigger fear, real, raw terror, and record the human response. We weren't passengers, we were test subjects." He turned to the next document, a transcript of intercepted communications between Orrin and an unidentified contact. They discussed thresholds, psychological triggers, patterns of panic. One line reads, "The child's cry will make the test pure." "That child," Marcus added, voice tight with emotion, "was my 6-month-old son." The officials exchanged tense glances. One began to scribble notes more quickly. Alden stepped forward, handing over a USB drive. "This contains audio logs, recovered messages, and portions of Orrin's search history. The pattern is clear. He wasn't working alone." Marcus paused, letting the silence settle like dust. He could feel the gaze of the room pressing against his skin, some skeptical, others shaken. His hands trembled slightly as he closed the folder. The pain of what he endured still lived in him, but today he controlled it. Today the fear served him. "Orrin may have fallen from that plane," Marcus continued, "but the Circle is still alive. They exploit the very systems we trust. Pilots, flight attendants, engineers, anyone can be a vessel for their madness. And unless we change how we protect passengers, they'll strike again." Thorne leaned forward. "And what do you propose, Mr. Delroy?" "I propose a mandate," Marcus said without hesitation. "Crew screening must be as thorough as passenger screening. Psychological evaluations should be regular, not optional. And we must acknowledge that the threat is no longer just in the cabin, it may be the cabin." He stepped back, his heart pounding. But he wasn't finished. "I've also founded the Ezra Foundation," he added, "named after my son. Its mission is simple: Protect families from invisible dangers in travel. We will monitor, advocate, and educate. Because no father should have to face what I did, and no child should be put in harm's way for someone else's twisted research." A moment passed, then another, and then quiet clapping began, first from the back row, then from the observers, and finally a few hesitant nods from the tribunal itself. As the tribunal called for a recess, Alden placed a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You changed the narrative today," he said quietly. Marcus looked at the floor, then at the exit of the chamber beyond it. The world waited, changed, uncertain, but watching. And though the shadow of the circle still lingered, Marcus's resolve was clear. If they ever tried again, he would be ready. Survival may end the story, but defiance begins the legacy. Seconds later, the father turned the tables, dragging him through the same door he threatened with. If you stand for protecting the innocent and punishing the guilty, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It addresses themes of racism, abuse of authority, and the violent consequences of unchecked prejudice. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic discrimination, provoke reflection on accountability in positions of trust, and inspire action toward justice and equality.